In the heart of a vibrant kingdom, where golden spires reached for the sky and bustling markets filled with the chatter of merchants and townsfolk, there lived a man named Kale. To most people, he was just another face in the crowd, a quiet figure who rarely spoke unless necessary. But those who truly knew him understood that Kale was no ordinary man. He was the royal bodyguard, sworn to protect Princess Serafina, the young heir to the throne. Kale wasn't born into nobility or privilege. In fact, his beginnings were humble. Raised in a small village on the outskirts of the kingdom, he grew up learning how to fight, not for glory, but for survival. His father had been a blacksmith, teaching him strength through hard work, while his mother instilled in him values like loyalty and honor. When tragedy struck their family, leaving Kale orphaned at a young age, he found himself drawn to the art of combat. Over time, his skills became unmatched, earning him recognition far beyond his tiny village. Years later, fate brought Kale to the palace. It started as a simple assignment to escort a caravan carrying supplies for the royal family. During the journey, bandits attacked, outnumbering the guards 10 to 1. While others hesitated, Kale stepped forward without fear. With swift movements and precise strikes, he dismantled the attackers, saving not only the goods but also the lives of everyone in the group. Among them was a young Princess Serafina, barely 8 years old at the time. She watched in awe as this stranger fought off danger with ease, planting the seeds of trust between them. From that day onward, Kale became her shadow. Whether it was walking through the gardens, attending ceremonies, or simply playing games in the courtyard, he was always nearby, watching over her. At first, some members of the court questioned his presence, believing someone so rough around the edges didn't belong in the polished halls of royalty. But Kale proved them wrong. Time and again, he demonstrated not only his skill, but also his devotion. For him, protecting Serafina wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Now, nearly a decade later, Kale stood tall as one of the most respected figures in the palace, though few outside its walls knew his name. He wore plain armor, avoiding anything flashy or ornate, because he believed a true protector didn't need recognition. His focus was singular: keep the princess safe, no matter what. But lately, something felt off. The kingdom was celebrating the king's birthday with grand feasts, parades, and performances. Nobles from neighboring lands arrived bearing gifts. Yet beneath their smiles, Kale sensed tension. Conversation stopped when he approached, and eyes lingered too long on the princess. Even the servants seemed uneasy, whispering about rumors of unrest brewing beyond the castle gates. One evening, as fireworks lit up the night sky, Kale noticed a hooded figure lingering near the stables. Most would have dismissed it as nothing, but Kale's instincts screamed otherwise. Quietly excusing himself from the festivities, he followed the stranger, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. What he discovered would change everything, for the kingdom, for the princess, and for himself. Little did anyone know, this quiet guardian was about to step into the role of a hero. And once Kale made up his mind to act, nothing, and no one, could stand in his way. The grand celebration for the king's birthday stretched into the night, with music echoing through the halls and laughter filling the air. Yet, amidst the joyous atmosphere, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. His sharp eyes scanned every corner of the palace grounds, catching details others might overlook. A flicker of movement in the shadows, a servant hurrying away too quickly, or an unfamiliar face lingering where it shouldn't be. It started small. A tray slipped from a server's hands near Princess Serafina's table, clattering loudly enough to draw gasps from nearby guests. The princess barely flinched, but Kale was already moving, positioning himself between her and the source of the noise. When he inspected the fallen tray, he noticed faint scratches on its underside, marks that suggested tampering. Could it have been meant to distract, or worse, to conceal something dangerous? Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, Cale spotted a courier slipping into the palace through a side entrance. Couriers weren't uncommon, especially during events like this, but something about this one struck him as odd. The man kept his hood low over his face and avoided making eye contact with anyone. Acting on instinct, Cale followed him discreetly until the courier disappeared into a dimly lit chamber used for storing documents. Without hesitation, Cale entered the room, his presence immediately causing the courier to freeze. "What business do you have here?" Cale asked calmly, though his tone carried an edge that demanded answers. The courier stammered, claiming he was delivering routine messages, but when Cale examined the sealed letters in his satchel, he found them written in code, an unusual choice for standard correspondence. Cale confiscated the letters and sent the courier away under guard, vowing to decipher their contents later. That night, by candlelight, he pored over the cryptic symbols, using his knowledge of ciphers gained from years of training. Slowly, the message began to take shape: plans for an attack on Princess Serafina. The details were vague, mentioning only a public gathering and a moment of vulnerability. But the intent was clear. Someone wanted her dead. Determined to act, Cale brought the evidence to the royal council the next morning. He laid out his findings carefully, explaining the coded letters and sharing his suspicions about the recent incidents. But instead of gratitude, he was met with skepticism. Lord Cedric, the king's brother, dismissed Cale's concerns outright, calling them baseless paranoia. Others echoed similar sentiments, suggesting that Cale's vigilance had made him overly cautious. Even the king seemed reluctant to believe such a threat existed within their own walls. Frustrated but undeterred, Cale left the meeting knowing he couldn't rely on the council to act. If anything happened to the princess, it would fall squarely on his shoulders. As he walked back to his quarters, Serafina approached him, her expression concerned. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "Do you really think someone is plotting against me?" Cale nodded gravely. "Yes, Your Highness. I don't know who yet, but they're clever and patient. We can't afford to wait for them to strike." Serafina placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we'll stop them together. You've always protected me, Cale. Trust your instincts." Her words bolstered his resolve. From that moment on, Cale dedicated himself fully to uncovering the truth. He began observing everyone more closely: the servants, the nobles, even those closest to the royal family. Every interaction, no matter how trivial, became a potential clue. He noticed how certain advisors exchanged nervous glances when the princess entered a room, or how some guards seemed hesitant to meet his gaze. Each observation fueled his determination to root out the danger before it could harm her. As days passed, Cale's investigation deepened. He spent hours retracing the courier's steps, questioning staff members, and searching for patterns in the coded messages. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear: whoever sought to harm Princess Serafina had underestimated the man sworn to protect her. And Cale intended to make sure they regretted it. The day of the ceremonial procession arrived, and the entire kingdom buzzed with excitement. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the streets were lined with cheering crowds eager to catch a glimpse of their beloved princess. Serafina rode in an ornate carriage adorned with gold and silk, waving gracefully to her people. Behind her stood Cale, his armor polished but plain, his posture alert and unwavering. To the casual observer, he blended into the background, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. As the procession moved through the city, Cale's instincts screamed louder than ever. Something about the crowd felt wrong. The smiles seemed forced, the cheers slightly off rhythm. He scanned faces, searching for anything unusual. A flicker of nervousness, a hand reaching too close to a weapon. Then, just as they passed a narrow alleyway, it happened. A sudden explosion of movement shattered the festive atmosphere. Masked figures burst from the shadows, wielding blades that glinted ominously in the sunlight. Panic erupted instantly. People screamed and scattered, trampling each other in their desperation to escape. The royal guards scrambled to form a defensive line, but the attackers were fast, slipping past them like ghosts. Cale sprang into action without hesitation. Years of training kicked in as he positioned himself directly between the assassins and the princess's carriage. His sword sang as it left its sheath, cutting through the air with precision. The first assassin lunged at him, aiming for a fatal blow, but Cale sidestepped effortlessly, countering with a strike that sent the attacker crumpling to the ground. Another came at him from behind, but Cale spun around, deflecting the blade with his own before delivering a swift kick that knocked the man unconscious. The chaos was overwhelming. Arrows whizzed overhead, fired by archers hidden in nearby rooftops. One grazed Cale's shoulder, drawing blood, but he didn't falter. Pain was irrelevant. Only the mission mattered. With every swing of his sword, every calculated step, he carved a path of protection around the princess. The royal guards, inspired by his bravery, rallied to his side, forming a human shield around the carriage. Despite the attackers' numbers, Cale's skill turned the tide. He fought not with brute force but with strategy, anticipating his enemies' moves before they made them. When one assassin tried to climb onto the carriage, Cale hurled a dagger with unerring accuracy, pinning the man's sleeve to the wooden frame. Another assailant aimed a poisoned blade at Serafina herself, but Cale intercepted him mid-strike, disarming him with a single fluid motion. By the time reinforcements arrived, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Bodies lay scattered across the cobblestones, and the surviving attackers flowed into the alleys, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The crowd, now silent and shaken, watched as Cale knelt beside the princess's carriage, ensuring she was unharmed. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but she managed a weak smile. "You saved me again," she whispered. Cale nodded curtly, though his mind was already racing. Who were these attackers? Where had they come from? And more importantly, how had they known about the procession? As medics tended to the wounded and soldiers secured the area, Cale examined the fallen assassins. Their masks concealed their identities, and their weapons bore no markings, clearly designed to leave no trace of their origins. Whoever orchestrated this attack had planned it meticulously. Serafina stepped out of the carriage, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering in her eyes. "This wasn't random," she said, looking at Cale. "They wanted me." He met her gaze, his expression grim. "Yes, Your Highness. Someone wants you gone. But I swear on my life, they won't succeed." Though the immediate danger had passed, the weight of the attack settled heavily over the kingdom. For Cale, there was no time to rest. Every moment counted now. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was plotting again. And next time, they might not fail. In the days following the attack, the palace was gripped by an uneasy tension. The once bustling halls now felt quieter, as if everyone moved with a sense of caution, afraid to speak too loudly or draw attention. Cale, however, was anything but still. Every waking moment was spent piecing together clues, retracing the events of that chaotic day, and searching for answers. He knew time was not on his side. The failed assassination attempt would only embolden whoever was behind it to try again. Cale began by questioning the servants who had been present during the procession. Many were reluctant to talk, either out of fear or loyalty to their superiors, but Cale's calm demeanor eventually coaxed them into sharing what they knew. One young maid mentioned overhearing strange conversations in the kitchens, a group of men speaking in hushed tones about the princess's route days before the attack. Another servant recalled seeing unfamiliar faces lingering near the stables late at night. Each tidbit may have seemed insignificant on its own, but to Cale, these fragments formed the beginnings of a larger puzzle. His investigation didn't stop there. Cale turned his attention to the nobles and advisors within the court, scrutinizing their actions more closely than ever before. Lord Cedric, the king's brother, caught his eye almost immediately. Cedric had always been ambitious, often vocal about his dissatisfaction with how the kingdom was run. During council meetings, he frequently challenged decisions made by the king, sometimes even mocking Serafina's role as heir. While none of this proved guilt, it planted seeds of suspicion in Cal's mind. Then there was Lady Evelyn, one of Princess Serafina's closest confidants. Evelyn had served the royal family for years, earning trust through her intelligence and charm. Yet something about her behavior lately struck Cal as odd. She seemed overly interested in the details of the attack, asking probing questions about the assassin's weapons and tactics, questions that went beyond mere curiosity. When Cal confronted her privately, she brushed him off with a laugh, saying she simply wanted to understand what had happened. But her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, and Cal filed the interaction away in his memory. As he dug deeper, resistance began to mount against him. Some members of the court accused him of overstepping his bounds, claiming his relentless questioning disrupted the harmony of the palace. Others whispered behind his back, suggesting he was paranoid or power-hungry. Even a few guards grew wary of his presence, feeling undermined by his authority. Despite the growing hostility, Cal pressed on, driven by the promise he'd made to protect Serafina. One evening, as he sifted through documents in his quarters, Serafina entered unannounced. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and concern. "You're working yourself to exhaustion," she said gently. "Let me help you. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Cal looked up from the papers, his voice firm but kind. "Your Highness, I appreciate your offer, but this is my duty. My job is to shield you from danger, no matter the cost." Serafina sighed, stepping closer. "And what happens if you push yourself too far? What happens if they come after you next?" Her words gave him pause, though only briefly. "I won't let that happen," he replied. "But if it does, I've trained others to take my place. The protection of the royal family will never falter." Though touched by her concern, Cal couldn't afford distractions. His focus remained razor-sharp as he continued unraveling the web of deceit surrounding the palace. Late one night, while reviewing intercepted letters and maps of the city, he noticed a pattern. Several attacks on lesser nobles and officials had occurred recently, all targeting individuals tied to trade agreements or political alliances. It was subtle, but undeniable. A coordinated effort to destabilize the kingdom. Suddenly, it clicked. Whoever was orchestrating these plots wasn't just after Serafina. They aimed to dismantle the entire royal line, and judging by the evidence, someone inside the palace was aiding them. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting golden light through the windows, Cal realized the truth. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls, it was within. Cal's suspicions led him down a dangerous path, one that twisted through the heart of the palace and into its darkest corners. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but each new discovery only deepened the mystery and the danger. His investigation had already pointed toward Lord Cedric, the king's brother, as a possible mastermind behind the assassination plot. But what truly shocked Cal was the growing evidence implicating Lady Evelyn, Serafina's trusted advisor. Evelyn's betrayal cut deeper than any blade. She had been a constant presence in the princess's life, offering guidance and support whenever needed. To think she could secretly be working against them felt like a violation of everything Cal stood for. Yet, the clues were undeniable. A coded letter found in Cedric's quarters bore handwriting eerily similar to Evelyn's. Witnesses reported seeing her meeting with strangers in secluded parts of the city. And then there was the way she always seemed to know exactly where Serafina would be, almost as if she were feeding information to their enemies. Determined to confront her, Cal waited until nightfall when the palace grew quiet. He knew Evelyn often worked late in the library, poring over documents and scrolls. When he entered the grand room, lined with towering shelves of books and flickering candles, he found her seated at a desk, seemingly engrossed in her work. "Lady Evelyn," Cal said, his voice steady but sharp enough to make her jump. "We need to talk." She turned slowly, her face calm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Cal, what brings you here so late?" "I've uncovered some troubling information," he began, stepping closer. Information that links you to the recent attacks on Princess Serafina. Evelyn's composure faltered for just a moment before she forced a smile. Surely you don't believe such nonsense. I've dedicated my life to protecting the princess. And yet, Cale countered, pulling out the coded letter. This handwriting matches yours perfectly. Care to explain? Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You're clever, Cale. Too clever for your own good. But do you really think accusing me will stop what's already in motion? Cale's jaw tightened. You're aiding Cedric, aren't you? Why? What could possibly drive you to betray the royal family? Evelyn sighed, her expression softening into something almost regretful. It's not about hatred or greed. It's about survival. This kingdom is crumbling under weak leadership. If Serafina takes the throne, nothing will change. Cedric offers a better future, a stronger future, a future built on bloodshed. Cale snapped, his voice rising slightly. You're willing to sacrifice innocent lives for power. It's not my decision to make, she replied coolly. But yes, sacrifices must be made for progress. You wouldn't understand. Cale took another step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. I understand loyalty, something you clearly lack. For a tense moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn broke the silence first, standing up and straightening her posture. Do what you must, Cale. But remember this, even if you expose me, it won't stop Cedric. He has allies everywhere, including places you'd never expect. With that, she swept past him, disappearing into the shadows of the library. Cale stood frozen, anger and frustration boiling inside him. He had hoped confronting Evelyn would bring clarity, but instead, it left him with more questions. How far did Cedric's influence reach? Who else might be involved? And most importantly, how could he protect Serafina from an enemy that seemed to lurk around every corner? As dawn approached, Cale resolved to act quickly. He couldn't trust anyone, not fully. Every servant, guard, and nobleman could potentially be part of the conspiracy. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to let it break him. Serafina's life depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to ensure her safety, even if it meant standing alone against the entire kingdom. The battle ahead wouldn't be fought with swords alone. It would require cunning, strategy, and unwavering determination. And Cale was ready. Cale knew he couldn't take on Cedric directly. Not yet. The man was powerful, with resources and influence that stretched far beyond the palace walls. To expose him, Cale needed proof. Irrefutable evidence that would leave no room for doubt in the eyes of the king or the royal council. And there was only one way to get it: infiltrate Cedric's stronghold. Disguising himself as a wandering mercenary, Cale crafted a new identity. He traded his polished armor for worn leather gear, dirtied his face with soot, and adopted a gruff demeanor. His goal was simple: gain entry into Cedric's ranks by posing as someone desperate for coin and willing to do whatever it took. It wasn't easy. Mercenaries were a suspicious lot, and Cedric's men were no exception. But Cale's years of training had taught him how to adapt, how to blend in without drawing attention. The journey to Cedric's fortress was long and treacherous, winding through dense forests and rocky hills. When Cale finally arrived, he found the place heavily fortified, surrounded by high stone walls and patrolled by armed guards. Still, he approached confidently, introducing himself as Rin, a lone fighter looking for work. After passing a brief test of combat skill, where Cale deliberately held back just enough to avoid suspicion, he was granted access. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but efficient. Supplies were being stockpiled, weapons sharpened, and plans whispered in shadowy corners. Cale listened carefully, piecing together fragments of conversation. He learned that Cedric intended to launch another attack on the royal family, this time during an upcoming diplomatic banquet at the palace. The plan involved smuggling disguised assassins into the event, using forged invitations to bypass security. Once inside, they would strike swiftly, eliminating not only Serafina, but also key members of the Royal Council. One evening, while pretending to clean weapons in the armory, Kell overheard two guards discussing Lady Evelyn's role in the scheme. She had been providing detailed layouts of the palace, including secret passages and guard rotations. Hearing her name made Kell's blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. Emotions wouldn't help him here. Focus would. As days passed, Kell gathered more intel, memorizing maps and noting weaknesses in Cedric's defenses. But danger lurked everywhere. One night, while sneaking through a restricted wing of the fortress, he nearly collided with Evelyn herself. She had come to deliver fresh instructions to Cedric's commanders. For a split second, their eyes met, and Kell feared she'd recognize him despite his disguise. "You there?" she called out sharply, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" Thinking quickly, Kell dropped into character, lowering his voice to a gravelly growl. "Just lost, milady. New around these parts." Evelyn studied him intently, her gaze piercing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded curtly. "Stay out of areas you don't belong in. Next time, I won't be so forgiving." Once she was gone, Kell exhaled silently, his heart pounding. That encounter had been too close. He realized he couldn't stay much longer without risking exposure. With the information he'd gathered, it was time to return to the palace and prepare for Cedric's next move. Before leaving, however, Kell planted seeds of doubt among Cedric's followers. During meals and casual conversations, he subtly questioned the Lord's leadership, hinting that failure might lead to punishment, or worse. While some dismissed his words, others seemed uneasy, glancing nervously at each other. If nothing else, Kell hoped to weaken Cedric's grip from within. Under cover of darkness, Kell slipped away from the fortress, carrying with him the knowledge needed to turn the tide. As he traveled back toward the palace, his mind raced with strategies. This wasn't just about stopping an attack anymore. It was about dismantling Cedric's entire operation. Failure wasn't an option. Not when Serafina's life hung in the balance. Armed with the information he had gathered from Cedric's stronghold, Kell returned to the palace under the cover of night. His disguise was gone, replaced by his familiar armor, and his demeanor was as resolute as ever. The weight of what he carried, both physically and mentally, was immense, but there was no time for rest. He immediately sought an audience with the king, determined to present his findings before it was too late. The king listened intently as Kell laid out the details of Cedric's plan. The forged invitations, the disguised assassins, the intended massacre during the diplomatic banquet. Kell also revealed Evelyn's role in providing maps and intelligence, though the king visibly struggled to believe that someone so trusted could betray them. "This is grave news," the king said finally, his voice heavy with concern. "But without solid proof, how can we act against my own brother?" Kell had anticipated this challenge. "Your Majesty, if we wait for proof, it will be too late. We must set a trap, one that forces Cedric to reveal himself." After much deliberation, the king agreed to proceed with Kell's plan. The banquet would go ahead as scheduled, but every aspect of it would be meticulously controlled. Hidden guards were stationed throughout the hall, dressed as servants or guests. Decoys resembling Serafina and other key figures were prepared to confuse any attackers, and Kell himself would remain at the princess's side, ready to strike at the first sign of trouble. The night of the banquet arrived, and the grand hall buzzed with activity. Nobles from neighboring kingdoms mingled with local dignitaries, exchanging pleasantries over fine wine and exquisite dishes. Serafina, radiant in her ceremonial gown, moved gracefully among the crowd, smiling and laughing as though nothing were amiss. Only those closest to her noticed the subtle tension in her eyes, a reflection of the storm brewing beneath the surface. As the evening progressed, Kell kept watch, his senses razor-sharp. He spotted several individuals whose invitations matched the forged ones he'd seen in Cedric's possession. They blended seamlessly into the crowd, their true intentions masked by polite smiles. But Cale knew better. Every movement they made was deliberate, every glance calculated. Then, just as dessert was being served, chaos erupted. Masked figures emerged from the shadows, drawing concealed weapons and charging toward the dais where the royal family sat. Panic spread like wildfire, but Cale sprang into action instantly. With swift precision, he neutralized 2 attackers before they could reach Serafina, while hidden guards swarmed the room, overwhelming the intruders. Amid the commotion, Cedric himself appeared, flanked by a small group of loyal mercenaries. His face twisted with rage as he realized the trap had been sprung. "You think you've won," he snarled, pointing his sword at Cale. "This kingdom deserves stronger leadership than a weak king and his foolish daughter." Cale stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Your greed blinds you, Cedric. A true leader protects their people, not destroys them." With that, the 2 men clashed in a brutal duel. Cedric fought with desperation, his blows fueled by anger and ambition. But Cale's skill was unmatched, honed by years of dedication and purpose. Blow by blow, he pushed Cedric back until finally disarming him with a powerful kick. As Cedric stumbled, unarmed and defeated, Cale held his blade to the traitor's throat. "It's over," Cale declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Guards rushed in to apprehend Cedric and his remaining followers, while Lady Evelyn, who had attempted to flee, was captured near the palace gates. The banquet hall fell silent as the reality of the betrayal sank in. Guests stared in shock, some whispering prayers of gratitude for their survival. Serafina approached Cale, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it," she said softly. "You saved us all." Cale shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, Your Highness. I simply did my duty. This victory belongs to everyone who stood against tyranny tonight." Though the immediate threat had been eliminated, the scars of the night would linger. For the kingdom, for its people, and especially for Cale. Yet as he looked around the hall, now secure once more, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the future of the realm was safe. For now, the aftermath of the banquet left the kingdom in a state of quiet reflection. The grand hall, once filled with laughter and celebration, now bore the scars of battle, overturned tables, shattered glass, and streaks of blood on the marble floors. Servants worked tirelessly to restore order, but the mood remained somber. For many, it was difficult to reconcile the betrayal of Lord Cedric and Lady Evelyn with the lives they had known. Trust, once so freely given, now felt fragile, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. Cedric's capture sent shockwaves through the court. Once a respected nobleman, he was now seen as a symbol of treachery. His trial was swift and public, conducted in the palace square for all to witness. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forged invitations, maps marked by Evelyn's hand, and testimonies from his own followers who had turned on him in fear of punishment. When the verdict came, guilty of high treason, the crowd erupted into cheers, though there was no joy in Cale's heart. He stood silently at the edge of the square, his expression unreadable. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain Cedric's actions had caused. Lady Evelyn's fate was decided separately. Unlike Cedric, she showed no remorse during her interrogation, defending her choices with cold logic. "I did what I believed was best for the kingdom," she insisted, her voice steady despite the chains binding her wrists. Her defiance earned her exile rather than execution, a decision made by the king out of respect for her years of service. As she was led away from the palace, her head held high, Serafina watched from a distance, her eyes filled with sadness. "She could have been great," the princess murmured to Cale. Instead, she chose destruction. In the weeks that followed, life in the palace slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such turmoil. The royal council worked tirelessly to rebuild trust among the nobility and commoners alike. New security measures were implemented, including stricter background checks for staff and advisors. Yet, amidst these changes, one constant remained: Kel's unwavering presence by Serafina's side. Though praised as a hero by many, Kel avoided the spotlight. He continued his duties quietly, ensuring the princess's safety without seeking recognition. To him, the real reward wasn't glory. It was knowing that Serafina was safe. One evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Serafina stopped and turned to face him. "Kel," she began, her voice tinged with emotion, "you've sacrificed so much for me. How can I ever repay you?" Kel met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "Your Highness, your gratitude is more than enough. My purpose has always been to protect you, to ensure that you live to lead this kingdom into a brighter future." Serafina smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "And you've done that, time and time again. But promise me one thing, don't carry this burden alone. You're not just my guardian, you're my friend. Let me help you when you need it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Kel allowed himself a small smile. "I'll remember that, Your Highness." As the days turned into months, the kingdom began to heal. Trade flourished once more, festivals resumed, and the people found hope in the resilience of their leaders. Kel remained vigilant, knowing that threats, both seen and unseen, would always exist. But he also found solace in the knowledge that he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Serafina, the king, and even some members of the council had come to trust him completely, valuing his wisdom and dedication. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the palace spires, Kel took up his usual post outside the princess's chambers. The air smelled of fresh rain and blooming flowers, a reminder of renewal and possibility. Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Kel faced them with the same resolve that had carried him through every trial thus far. For as long as he drew breath, he would stand guard, not just as a protector, but as a symbol of loyalty, honor, and unwavering strength. And so, the kingdom moved forward, guided by a princess determined to bring peace and prosperity, and protected by a man who had proven time and again that true courage lies not in seeking glory, but in serving others selflessly.